growth in many countries and regions. The euro area is the world's second leading economy, with 17% of global GDP. As the number of active Europeans declines, Europe's share of the world economy will drop to 12% by 2030 and just 9% by 2060. Japan, which accounts for 7% of global GDP today, faces a similar crisis. Its aging population will push its share of global GDP down to 4% by 2030 and just 3% by 2060. Today, the 34-country OECD represents 65% of global GDP. This will drop to just 43% in 2060, smaller than China and India, and well below the combined GDP of emerging economies. Incomes and living standards in emerging economies will converge with those in the OECD. Today, per capita GDP in countries like China, India, Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil, Mexico, and Turkey is just a fraction of that in the United States. After 50 years of rapid growth and shifting wealth, the emerging countries have drastically reduced the income gap with the United States. Richer OECD countries like France, Italy, Spain, Ireland, Greece will see their per capita income fall when compared with the US. None of these OECD projections are set in stone. Improving public finances and implementing bold structural reforms can boost long-term growth and living standards in advanced and emerging economies alike.
So that video was a great way to introduce you to what the global economy looks like today, some of the numbers associated with that, and what it could look like in the future to help build a foundation for our conversation. Moving on, we're going to talk a little bit more about absolute and comparative advantage. Few countries can actually produce all of the goods and services that they need. Trade meets the demands for products that are not produced domestically. If there's something here in the United States that we simply do not produce, we need to trade with other nations in order to obtain it. Generally, a country will produce what it does best, and then it exports the surplus. Remember from our economics material, this is the extra supply that there isn't a demand for, and buys what it needs. Now, an absolute advantage and a comparative advantage are very similar, so make sure you understand the distinction between the two. When we talk about an absolute advantage, here a country has an advantage if it has a monopoly on producing a product, or it can produce it at a lower cost than any other competitor. This really gives that nation an advantage. An example of this would be De Beer Mining in South Africa. It's the largest producer and distributor of diamonds in the world. It's a great example of an absolute advantage. Now, a comparative advantage is when a nation has a product or can supply it more efficiently and at a lower price than another nation. So it's not that it's really the only option or the best option, it's just a better option than what the country can do itself. A good example of that is China and their textile production. So while you could get, let's say, the clothing article from the United States, it might be better quality and lower cost point if it's produced out of China. We're going to move on now to describe how trade gets measured between nations. When we talk about a balance of trade, this concept is the difference between a nation's exports and imports. You'll see there'll be a trade surplus, that extra product available, which occurs when a nation exports more than it imports. So here you have more goods leaving your nation, going out of your nations, than you do having coming in. Similar to a trade surplus, when we talk about a trade deficit, this occurs when you import more than you export. The nation has more goods coming in than it has going out, an unfavorable balance. The U.S. has been in this type of trade deficit since 1976. Again, that means the United States has more goods coming in than it has going out in terms of international trade. However, it's the world's top exporter and it buys more foreign goods than it sells. For more information on what America exports, you can click on the link on the screen. I'm actually going to show this to you because it's a really neat site that shows some of what America has coming in and out of its nation. So when we look at this, let me just move the screen over here. It says what America sells to the world, and it talks about this myth that the U.S. doesn't make anything anymore. Here you'll see we export a lot. In the article, it says it exported worth $2.1 trillion. This is a very large amount, which raises a simple question: what are we exporting? So it's mostly goods, but some services. You'll see a good graphic of that on the screen. And if you like some of the graphics from the video you just saw or this article here, you can actually create graphics like this using Tableau, Tableau, which interacts with Excel. You can also use something called Pictochart, Pictochart, and tools and resources like this are available under our business toolbox on our course site to help give you some good free resources. Now here there's a closer look on what exactly these goods being exported are. So you'll notice a lot of it are things like machinery, computers, industrial supplies, a small amount of it food and cars, and then some consumer goods as well. Here's an example of the services that are exported as well. So you can see things like travel, royalty licensing, military-related services, and then private services, things like education, financial, legal support. So we get to see who's buying these as well. You'll notice one major buyer for the US is Canada, another Mexico, and then we see China, Japan, and the UK underneath those. Obviously, the geographic location of Canada and Mexico and some of the trade agreements we'll talk about later on that exist with them does help create this larger market with them. Here are the top goods we're selling, so you can see some of what we're selling to each of these areas. And again, for those of you that want to dive deeper into this, you do have the links. You can take a look further, but it just gives you a good idea of what is actually being exported from the United States. The balance of payments is another way that we look at trade. This is the difference over a period of time between the overall flow of money coming into and out of a country. Generally, it's impacted by things like overseas loans, investments, profits from both, and even foreign aid payments. Another way you might see trade impacted is through exchange rates. Now, hopefully this isn't your first time learning about exchange rates. You may even have experienced them depending on the amount of travel you've already done, even if it's for business or just leisure. The exchange rate is the ratio at which one nation's currency is exchanged for the currency of another nation. It's basically what the US dollar would be worth if you're traveling to another country and using their own currency overseas. Some factors that influence those exchange rates are things like economic and political conditions, central bank intervention, the balance of payment position we just spoke about, as well as speculation over future currency values. If a foreign currency goes up relative to the US dollar, Americans must pay for goods and services purchased from sellers in that country and vice versa. Okay, so how much money is your money worth? Now, the exchange rate is important because it changes so often. It's something that's constantly changing. And so in doing business, you need to be careful in talking about what currency an exchange is being made in. If you're contracting with a business that's using a different currency, you need to set the currency that you're going to be using, or you need to agree to what the value of that currency would be and at which rate you'd have that exchange. For example, at a really simple level, I married my husband in the Dominican Republic overseas. Now, generally, if you're doing business with a business overseas, you'll notice that they give estimates in US dollars of what it will cost you. But it's just an estimate until you actually pay. So we paid for that wedding, the hotel service, once it was over and right before we left. Depending on the exchange rate, at that time, which was months after we actually agreed to make the reservation with the resort, months later we're saying, hey, now we're going to pay. The exchange rate could have made our US dollar worth more or a lot less than we originally planned. So that's something that you want to think about if you're doing business overseas, is that it's an estimate. Making a decision about when you'll actually make the payment, that it will be when the exchange rate applies, and trying to make sure that when you're dealing with millions of dollars, the exchange rate could make a big impact in what your overall profit can be from a contract. So you want to keep that in mind, how that exchange rate is impacting the actual value of the money being generated from a contract. We're going to talk now about how cultural economic, and legal or political barriers can impact, restrict, or support international trade. Okay, some good ways to think of that. We'll start with social and cultural differences. At a really basic level, it starts with language. Potential problems can occur if there's mistranslation, and also inappropriate messaging, or just a lack of understanding of local customs and differences in taste. A good example of a language barrier, if you go to a doctor's office and you're trying to explain to your doctor what's wrong with you, you're doing that in English. However, your doctor does not speak English, they only speak Spanish. You're going to have a miscommunication. There will be an issue in how well they can understand what your ailments are. Now, hopefully there'll be some translation there, but even a translator, some of the things can get lost in that translation. So it's really important in a business setting that you have people who can understand different languages as you're dealing with different consumer groups that speak different languages. Okay, and then also that you understand that there can be some differences in customs and things. Something simple like a greeting can be a big deal. Here in the United States, it's a clear eye contact, it's a handshake, it's a smile. There are some cultures where making eye contact can be disrespectful. And so you want to be careful to understand some of the culture, language, values in a culture when you're doing business with other nations. Values and religious attitudes also play into that. So there can be different values about business efficiency, employment levels, the importance of religious differences, practices, holidays. Here in the United States, not all businesses give people time off for Jewish holidays, for example, whereas, in Israel, you might get a very different experience. Can you try to think of a specific issue, tradition, or social norm with another culture that an American should be sensitive to in doing business within that culture? And maybe from your home if you're born outside the United States, or it might be an experience a friend told you, or even something you experienced in a business setting. So an example I like to give, my family is Italian, we're from Rome, and so I like to talk about timing. Here in the United States, when I worked for a company like Deloitte Consulting, you needed to be on time, and on time really means like 10, 15 minutes early. If there is a meeting at noon, you need to be there at 11:45 to be on time. Now in Italy, it's often a different experience. I still have family that do work with Italian businesses, and it's really more, you don't have to be 10, 15 minutes early. If someone shows up half an hour late, you wouldn't just leave and not be at that meeting. It's more the norm, and it's not something that's a sign of disrespect. It's just a different way of business. Now, there also are economic differences in infrastructures, and this is a big part of business. Basic systems of communication, transportation, energy, and financial systems impact business. For example, I used to work for AT&T some time ago, and at the time, the small town that I was from did not have any cell phone service. That's a big deal to think about. If you need cell phone service or internet service and you're not able to access that, it impacts your ability to do business. Same thing, some areas of the small town I grew up in, there weren't actually paved roads. And so that makes transportation also an issue, how close an airport is. And so as you start doing business in other countries, there might not be as much developed infrastructure as you're used to here in the United States. There can also be currency conversion and shifts. We see fluctuating values that can make pricing in local currencies very difficult, just as we talked about with exchange rates. There are also political and legal differences. So the stability of the political climate, and we've seen a lot of changes with that in the United States even. Okay, how we interact in the United States based on our political system with other nations certainly impacts our trade. And we'll talk more about that. We might get further taxes or more restrictions on our ability to trade with a nation depending on our political relationships with that nation. It also impacts business on a legal level. The United States has a set of laws that regulate our business, but they're only bound within the United States. Each country has its own laws and regulations that impact business. And so it's important if you're doing business overseas in other countries to make sure that you not only understand business here in the United States, but that you're also, accommodating the laws in other countries and making sure you're familiar with them and that you're adhering to them as well. Corruption's a big part of that, and it's a good example of how the law plays into business. A major law that relates to business in the United States is what's known as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. This forbids United States companies from bribing foreign officials, candidates, or government representatives. However, many countries, corruption is actually commonplace in many business settings. Okay, so for example, if I'm a new business in a country where corruption is illegal, but it's kind of a standard conduct, I might be asked as a business to provide $50,000, slip that under the table to a foreign official or a candidate in order to get the permits I need for my business. Well, as a U.S. company, I'm forbidden under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act from actually doing just that. And so that can be a disadvantage in doing business overseas, is that we can't engage in that same kind of corrupt business practices that might be standard place. And so it's something to consider and think about in how you do business. So think about which countries seem to have the most corruption. I talk about this example in my classroom, and I'll get a student who comes from a nation where corruption is commonplace. And the example I love to give is you're speeding. So you're speeding in this country and corruption's commonplace. The cop pulls you over, a government official, and they say, hey, you're speeding, and I'm going to give you a ticket. You slip them $50, $100, and suddenly you're not getting a ticket and they're on their way. Okay, if that's your normal standard business conduct, great. Now you leave that country, you're here in the United States, you get pulled over for speeding and you try to slip the cop that $50, $100, you're going to find yourself in jail. So just like that personal experience in business, you need to be aware and familiar of the different regulations and laws impacting your conduct when you're operating in that state. Now, trade restrictions are something you should be familiar with. There are many trade restrictions that exist. Tariffs are a big part of that. They're taxes, surcharges, duties on foreign products that help actually generate income for the government. If you think about it, if I own a business here in the United States and I'm exporting a good to China for sale, the Chinese government isn't getting money from me because I'm not a business operating in China getting taxed in China. So this is a way for them to tax the business and generate some income for the Chinese government. Now, there are additional administrative barriers to be familiar with. A quota, for example, is the limit on the amount of a product that can be imported over a specific period of time. So the amount of goods that can be coming in can be limited to a certain quantity. An embargo imposes a total ban on a specific product, and it says this product cannot be brought into our country. Now, another type of administrative barrier that is sometimes confusing for students is what's known as dumping. This is the act of selling a product abroad at a really low price. Now, I tell this to students and they immediately think about things like Walmart selling low-price goods, and it's not the same thing. Dumping is really a weapon, if you want to think about it that way. It's being sold at such a low price that it's a weapon. Okay? And so let me give you an example to help illustrate that. This cell phone, an Apple phone, let's say it costs $600 to produce. Okay, so businesses here sell it to consumers maybe for $800 to generate some profit. Well, now there's a business coming from overseas and they come in, and while it costs them $500 to make this phone, they're selling it for $200. It cost them $500, they're selling it for $200 in the United States. How much money are they making? In fact, they're losing a few $100s. So why would a business that's supposed to generate profits be trying to lose money? Well, if you think about it, if there's a business selling this iPhone for, $200 for $200, even though it cost them $500, they're losing a few hundred every time. Ultimately, we as consumers, if it's the same product, we're going to buy that $200 iPhone, not the $800 one. And suddenly, all the other businesses that offered the iPhone at the regular price, it wasn't below the cost it took to make it, they're losing business. All that's left is the business that's selling for $200, and suddenly they can drive the price up, as we saw with a monopoly, and they can charge $1,000, and we're going to be stuck in a bad place. So if a government feels like, hey, this is a company selling a product at a low price as a way to be a weapon against competitors, you could be fined for dumping. We'll now talk about how we reduce some of these barriers to international trade, like the tariffs, dumping that we just talked about. So let's talk about that reduction in those barriers. First, I want to discuss what's known as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. Most industrialized nations founded this agreement back in 1947, and the idea here was to reduce those tariffs, those taxes, relax those quotas on the goods imported. The most recent version of this is signed by 126 nations as recently as 1994. Now, the World Trade Organization was established by that agreement with representatives from 153 countries. It serves as an international court which hears complaints about violations and helps to reduce tariffs, ultimately promoting trade. The World Bank is another key function when we talk about reducing administrative barriers. Established after World War II, it was to lend money to developing nations. It helps fund projects that build or expand a nation's infrastructure. So some of the challenges we talked about, like transportation, or things like education and medical systems that help provide that infrastructure for business. Okay, what's really interesting is due to our physical location here in Washington, D.C., you have places like the World Bank headquarters right here, as well as the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund makes short-term loans to member countries that are unable to meet budgetary expenses. So it's a lender really of last resort to struggling nations. I'm going to introduce a few economic communities. Of course, as our political climate's changing, there's changes all the time, we do see some changes in the barriers we talked about and how lax some of these reductions to those barriers can be. These agreements help to form some of those ways to benefit countries involved, but they're only as good as our relationships with those nations, and so they can be changing depending on the U.S. relationship with those nations. So an example to start is what's known as NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Created in 1994, this agreement's actually between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and it creates the world's largest free trade zone. We see the types of barriers to trade that we talked about previously, like tariffs, being completely relaxed between these three nations. And the reason for it is that we're close to Mexico, we're close to Canada. There's not a huge cost for a business to export goods from the United States to Canada. It's a simple truck carrying products rather than a plane having to carry the product overseas. And so it can create an advantage for the businesses in all three of these countries to relax some of those barriers to trade we talked about earlier. Similarly, you'll see CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement of 2005. So just like we see with NAFTA, with America, Mexico, and Canada, we see many different nations coming together with the United States in Central America, such as Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, the Dominican, Nicaragua, and creating a similar type of free trade agreement to try to relax some of those barriers and ultimately be a win-win for the nations involved. Finally, you'll see the European Union, which is a common market involving 27 countries, over 500 million people, and here we see them trying to create some consistencies within Europe to help improve business. Now I want to talk a little bit about the decisions to go global. And there's some concepts here you should be familiar with for assessments in our class that relate to this idea of going global. First of all, there's this idea of offshoring. So this is the relocation of business processes to lower cost nations overseas. So for example, you might offshore a production facility for a car company like Toyota to a place like Japan because it can be lower costs. Now here we have a lot of restrictions about how much you have to pay an employee, benefits that need to be provided, safety in the workplace, a lot of regulation, and they usually support the worker. Okay, so many businesses will go to other nations to be able to pay a little less for that very large expense of wages to an individual. That example is known as offshoring. Counter trade is a term that consists of payments made in the form of local products rather than currency. You can think of this like bartering. Okay, me giving you some pens in exchange for pencils. Now, a major term you absolutely should be familiar with when we talk about global business is what's known as a multinational corporation. This is a firm that has significant operations and marketing activities outside its home country. So while the United States might be the home place of business for a place like Coca-Cola, if they have operations in another nation, they're known as a multinational corporation. When we talk about strategies for international business, managers have to evaluate objectives, strengths, weaknesses, and strategies in going global, just like you would in a business here in the United States. They then choose between a global and a multi-domestic business strategy. Now again, these are similar, but they have unique they're unique concepts, and it's good to make sure you understand the distinction between the two for our course. So let's start with going global. This type of international business strategy is very standardized. It allows a firm to sell the exact same product throughout the world using the same marketing methods. It works for things like jewelry. You can sell the same jewelry here in the United States as you might sell in another nation such as Mexico. Those rings are going to be pretty, and they're not going to have to be tailored too much to the market. A multi-domestic strategy differs. Here you have to treat each national market in a different way. So for example, in the United States, many of us frequent McDonald's. At McDonald's, you generally will not see alcohol being sold here in the United States. However, overseas, where having a beer might be a common thing you do over lunch with a work colleague, where drinking is more of a social thing that is more prevalent in other nations, you would see this menu item being offered at a McDonald's. Likewise, you may not see certain menu items, so something like a veggie burger could be more prominent on a menu, or you might not even see burgers on a menu, depending on the values of that culture. That type of tailored marketing strategy and business menu is known as a multi-domestic business strategy. Again, global, you're going to see things more standardized, and they won't need to be tailored as much to the specific market it's being sold in. I want to give an example of that. Accenture has a great partnership with our school, and they're a good business to take a look at if you want to learn more about the professional service and consulting industry. Accenture comes and they've generally given talks to our business students. This slide came from one of the talks they did on some of the global business topics students would be interested in. Here they talk about one of their clients, which was CocaCola. CocaCola applied primary and secondary research. So their own original source information from primary research, and then secondary research looking at articles being posted and data available on the web to develop what's known as Minute Maid Pulpy. Here we look at a business who's trying to create a product to be sold overseas that's being sold here in the United States. And this helps illustrate the idea of a multi-domestic strategy. So first, Coca-Cola has to research the problem. They assess whether or not there's a demand for something like juice, which is clearly a demand in the United States. They need to figure out if there's the same type of demand in another large market like China. They investigate price scenarios against customers' buying power and behavior. So this is something simple like going up to a group of potential buyers, going up to some people on the street and giving them a quick survey saying, here's some juice, try the juice. Is this something that you'd be willing to buy? Is this something you like? How much would you be willing to pay? Ultimately trying to figure out whether or not there's a willingness and ability to buy that juice in this specific market. Now they're going to look at those results, and when they did so, they concluded that the largest market existed for juice-based drinks in China. So looking at where to expand to, they found China to be a great location because they did see a demand there for this product. Consumers were looking for a healthier beverage option than something like soda, and it was more affordable. So they experiment. They look at price research, and it indicates that Coke would need to sell drinks made up of no more than 10% real juice. What that means is to get the price at a place where consumers are comfortable buying it in China, they found that they could not have the expense of having 100% juice. It would just cost too much. They wouldn't be able to make the money back in the sale price. Customers actually ended up reacting, though, very negatively to this lack of real juice taste. When there was less than 10% real juice in the juice, it was something that was deterring customers. So Coke added orange pulp to the drink to make it feel like juice at a smaller cost than actually offering 100% real juice. For the final product, Coke launched what was known as Minute Maid Pulpy in China and expanded the product in Asia. In 2011, Minute Maid Pulpy became the 14th brand owned by Coke to achieve global retail sales in excess of $51 billion. So this is how you can see an example of a US product trying to expand into a new market overseas, evaluating which market would be the right fit, and making sure that there's a demand, a willingness, and ability to buy. Here in China, the ability to buy was at a price that impacted the way that they actually made the juice. They had to offer at a lower cost. And so they took out some of that real juice. They added some pulp to help make a low-cost solution, and ultimately it was beneficial to Coca-Cola as a company, as we see on the screen. So business innovation that leads to growth is not in the research or data findings. It's achieved by strategically acting on and testing results in the market. And I think the takeaway that the presenter was giving here from Accenture, and that we see here from this case, is that when you're doing business in another market, you need to experiment. You need to get down into the culture, learn about its values, work with the people there, and find a solution that's innovative and creative that fits that particular culture and nation's needs. We've now come to the end of our international business topic. Now again, if you're interested in business, this is something you should be familiar with because so many businesses are expanding into their new markets like we saw with Coca-Cola and their Minute Maid pulpy juice in China. So it's important to make sure that you're familiar with some of the concepts, that you consider things like the language barriers, the culture differences, that you understand some of the regulations that can impact how you do business in other countries. I hope you found this presentation helpful, and I look forward to talking with you more on some of our other topics for Introduction to Business. Thank you.